Wealth inequality has increased for two main reasons. The first is quantitative easing. Gilt is a loan to the government which can be traded or sold. Essentially, the central bank created money electronically, or printed money for simplicity, to fund government spending. This £450 billion was injected into the economic system. £250 billion of this was used to buy assets. Creating money electronically to buy gilts creates more demand for these gilts, so the gilt prices rise. If the gilt prices rise, then they are deemed less risky assets as they generate better returns. This means the yield, which is the amount that you have to pay someone to hold government debt to compensate risk, falls because less risky assets require less money to compensate risk. This causes private sector firms and households who hold existing gilts, which now generate lower returns, look for alternative assets with better yields, as they will receive more money than they would from buying gilts. This surge in demand for other assets such as housing, stocks and gold pushes up asset prices, which in turn increases wealth inequality. The second is the cash cycle. Household budgets consist of income and expenditure. Low-income households spend a large proportion of their income on necessities like food, energy and mortgage payments. High-income households spend a much lower proportion of their income on necessities and a much higher proportion of their income on luxury, non-essential spending. In the pandemic, the government gave $100 billion to just over 5 million workers, cover 80% of their salaries. These were known as furlough payments as part of the job retention scheme. 9 million workers slipped through the net and didn't receive furlough payments. These furloughed workers tend to be from low-income households, so spending or expenditure on necessities remained constant. This means that their incomes decreased because they're only receiving 80% of their salary, but their expenditure stayed constant, and so the furloughed and non-furloughed middle and low-income household workers' discretionary income fell. Most businesses didn't get richer or gain greater profits because they were closed down. Who did get richer? High-income household customers. Spending on luxury non-essential services decreased significantly during the pandemic, so their expenses fell significantly as savings increased. Incomes remained constant or increased because they were still able to use tech to work from home and utilise diversified income streams from property, stocks and shares, which increased in value due to QE. Rising or stable discretionary incomes together with falling expenditure leads to rich households getting richer. Hence you've got a divide between low income customers and high income customers, the rich customers getting richer and the poor customers getting poorer. So why does wealth inequality matter? The chain goes something like this. In a wealth unequal economy where wealth is disproportionately held by the richest in society, workers have less bargaining power to negotiate higher salaries, and wealthy people continue to buy existing assets from the middle and lower classes. This means you get rising asset prices which become less affordable for certain groups in society, together with stagnant real wages. Rising asset prices and stagnant wages create social immobility, which is the difficulty to move between different classes. This is because the main way to afford a reasonable standard of living when raising a family is to buy a house, so that you're not subject to rogue landlords, rising yearly rental fees and renovation restrictions. This wealth accumulation in the upper classes, whilst incomes have remained stagnant for the lower classes, means that working a well-paying job, even if 2.5 times the median income, is not always a sufficient way to acquire wealth when competing with people who inherit significant sums and deposits worth hundreds of thousands of pounds from their parents. In the new asset economy where middle-income jobs do not provide a decent standard of living, it becomes very difficult to move between classes. You get social mobility and financial insecurity for the lower classes. You also get an over-concentration of luxury services that are not accessible to everyone, and a geographical over-concentration of population in areas where all the decent paying jobs are. We see this in areas such as London, Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham and other inner city areas which have experienced greater poverty rates and greater crime rates, along with other social problems that come with it. In addition, there are rising yearly rental prices as landlords have bargaining power over their tenants. London households spend an average of 40% of their median income on rent, and that's why London has one of the highest absolute poverty rates in the UK at 17%. Final impact is that under the current system, which taxes income sufficiently but not wealth, you'll find that the government resorts to austerity if they can't extract as much money from poorer households, so raise taxes to fund spending. This cycle is very dangerous, and so if we don't reduce wealth inequality, or at least redistribute some of the wealth accumulated during COVID, I believe that it will result in greater poverty rates, a further decline in the real standard of living, more extremist attitudes as people seek scapegoats instead of holding holding the government to account. So what are the stats which back this up? Well, since COVID began, the government debt has increased by £700 billion, which is enough for £14,000 to go to every adult household in the UK population. But this spending has ended up in an overconcentration of wealth held by the top 10% of the population. The second is that the average billionaire increased their wealth 22%, with the top 250 richest people in the country being on average 175 million better off than pre-pandemic. There are now 4,500 people in the UK with wealth greater than £42 million, and from 1992, billionaire wealth in the UK has increased from 54 billion to 653 billion, with the number of billionaires increasing from 17 to 177. Renting makes up an average of 26% of household income, and when you put this together with rising energy bills together with declining real incomes, it is inevitable that the poor will get poorer while the rich get richer. 750,000 mortgage holders are currently at risk of default. Ultimately, we will see falling real incomes, increased borrowing and mortgage defaults for low and middle income households, and the opposite for high income households, unless the government looks into finding new ways to tax wealth. So what are the solutions? One possible solution would be a wealth tax. The LSE mentions that a 1% wealth tax on those with a net wealth greater than £1 million would raise £260 billion over the next 5 years. A 1% wealth tax on those with net wealth greater than £2 million would raise £80 billion. This is such a tiny wealth tax, yet it would raise significantly more than Hunt's stealth taxes. The only concerns here are that you can see from those figures mentioned that this wealth tax would disproportionately affect those whose wealth lies within the region between 1 to 2 million. The second policy could be to equate capital gains tax with marginal income rates. Then you may have the problem of people not realising their gains and using a buy, hold and die approach, so that the people who inherit their wealth only pay capital gains tax on subsequent gains after death. The third would be to means test index linked pensions on a graduated basis, where the pensions will decline by 4% each year for those who do not need it because their wealth or income is above a threshold that makes it necessary. The government already spends north of 100 billion on pensions every year, and so cutting out unnecessary spending on people's pension pots who do not need those pension pots will not only save money for redistribution but also help to reduce wealth inequality. So what are the critiques? Well, one critique is that if you tax the rich, they'll just leave the country under the theory of the brain drain, which says that if you raise the marginal rate of tax high enough, then it will lead to a flight of high-skilled workers, which will decrease productivity and decrease the productive capacity of the economy. And the Laffer curve essentially says that if you increase tax rates beyond the maximising tax rate on the Laffer curve, then tax revenue will decrease due to tax avoidance, tax evasion and transfer pricing. I think that these arguments blow the wealth tax proposed way out of proportion. Wealth tax could be as low as 1%. Is that really an incentive to leave the country? Secondly, people are mobile but their assets are not. It's very unlikely that wealthy people would leave within the flick of a switch just because of a 1% wealth tax. Their assets, or at least some of their assets, can still be taxed, which would most likely increase and not decrease tax revenue. Personally, I think the Laffer curve argument is most relevant to income taxes, not wealth taxes on such a small scale. Brain drain is very tenuous, as the opportunity cost of a 1% wealth tax versus leaving the country is minuscule. However, a fair point to mention would be that countries would need to renegotiate their double taxation treaties with other countries, which is becoming increasingly difficult in the deglobalising world. This is because, essentially, if a UK citizen were to leave to live in a different country and stayed in that country for 90 days, then they would no longer be ordinarily resident in the UK, and this means that if the UK had a double taxation treaty with that other country, which said that if that other country was taxing this citizen who's now considered to be a citizen of the other country, then the UK can't tax this citizen on their wealth or income from the UK. And so it has to be argued that wealth tax requires global cooperation to be successful. Next criticism would be, what about double taxation on people who've worked hard to spend their money on a house? Our response would be that the tax would target the very wealthiest of the wealthy. Many multi-millionaires and billionaires are also quite altruistic and would be willing to pay a 1% tax, for example the group Patriotic Millionaires. It would be better to target larger taxes on wealth to those with wealth greater than £10 million, for example. This would still raise significant amounts for redistribution, make house or rent prices more affordable. Admittedly, it would be less, but even still. This shouldn't target the people who have spent most of their remaining income after tax tax on property should target the wealthy families that are hoarding wealth and property whilst paying virtually no tax. We call the UK a progressive tax system, but it's only a progressive tax system for income. If you had a list of the top taxpayers and the richest people in the country by net wealth, there'd be little crossover because their assets are not taxed properly. The third criticism is, what about meritocracy? Well, contrary to what this piece suggests, I support meritocracy myself. However, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that the average billionaire's increasing their wealth by 22% in a pandemic, whilst 50% of households are struggling to afford their food, energy and mortgage payments, is unfair. It's not fair that those born into rich families can inherit substantial amounts of wealth without doing anything, whilst those born into poorer families, even if they work a job that earns over 3.5 times the median income, cannot afford to buy a house. After this small blip in house prices from interest rates, it's likely that house prices will keep rising into perpetuity, and the only people who can afford them will be people with financial support from their families. Next question is, what's wrong with the existing taxes? We already tax wealth, don't we? Firstly, let's just look at income tax. So income tax doesn't tax wealth, but even still, it's easily avoidable and people can transfer their income to wealth, which is why it's easily avoidable. Top taxpayers and the wealthiest people rarely cross over because income is taxed progressively, but wealth is not. The top earners are not the same as the top wealth holders. The next tax is capital gains tax, which is roughly 20% but varies significantly. I think you could align capital gains tax with marginal income rates, but people might not realise their gains, or may just use a buy, hold and die approach, so that after they die, the person who inherits their wealth only has to pay capital gains tax on subsequent increases after death. The other taxes on wealth include inheritance tax, which has a 40% base mark but varies. Inheritance tax is avoidable through gift without reservation 7 years before death, and stamp duty is a 12 to 18% base mark tax on properties over £325,000, which fluctuates sometimes. I believe this should be higher for second and third and so on home ownership. Would there be problems with liquidity if you had a wealth tax? Personally, I think if I had to guess, then most people can make 1% of their wealth liquid each year to pay in tax. Most people would make a greater proportion of their wealth liquid spend on goods and services each year. So again, that's taking the argument of a wealth tax out of proportion. However, there is data to support the argument that a wealth tax has historically failed and so it would fail in the future, as shown by the fact that when France introduced their wealth tax under Francis Mitterrand, 4,500 millionaires left the country. Denmark's wealth tax has led to a mass migration of the population to Switzerland, which they are still tackling at this moment. I do believe that with global cooperation, however, and the renegotiation of double taxation treaties, which is very, very difficult to achieve, then a wealth tax could be feasible. An alternative could be a land value tax, as all land is registered on the land registry, and so it wouldn't be so difficult to tax people's wealth, and it wouldn't have the same administrative burdens as a wealth tax might. I agree that wealth inequality is a global problem, but the UK are not addressing it with their current levelling up missions. Taking away 15 billion from local councils across the past 20 years and then giving out a new 2.8 billion levelling up fund is hardly levelling up. I've written a whole essay about regional levelling up in Blackpool, and I agree that it would be transformational to certain parts of the area, such as the enterprise zone, the shopping centre, the tramline extension, refurbishing derelict B&Bs turned into poor quality HMOs, etc. But this is a large scale problem, and so blanket policies are needed to even up distribution as far as I'm concerned. Wealth taxes have failed in countries such as France and Denmark, but have succeeded somewhat in countries such as Spain. Whether it's a net wealth tax or a land value tax, I think that wealth needs to be taxed more aggressively in the UK, particularly when you factor into account what happened in the pandemic. It should at the very least be discussed from an economics viewpoint, but politicians seem to turn a blind eye to it due to its controversy.